Good evening and welcome. I'd like to invite you to come in and find a seat. Welcome to our event tonight, Artificial Intelligence, Threat or Promise. We're glad that you're here. We think this is going to be a fascinating conversation, but it's one we don't just want you to listen to, but also to participate in. So if you have a way of connecting to the internet, a phone, a tablet, or even a laptop, if you would pull that out now, we're going to be using a service tonight called Pigeonhole. To use this, you'll type in pigeonhole.at into the web browser. Once you get there, it'll ask for a passcode. Our passcode for this evening will be UFQA. Again, that is pigeonhole.at, and the passcode is going to be UFQA. You'll have two ways that you can interact with us tonight. One is, as Dr. Lennox presents, you can ask a question. The second way is you can get on there and see the questions that others are asking, and you can upvote separate questions. So at the end of the night, the questions that are most relevant to the topic and that have the most number of votes will be asked to Dr. Lennox. So again, that is pigeonhole.at, passcode UFQA, and we welcome your participation. Tonight, to introduce our speaker is the president of the University of Florida, Dr. Kent Fox.
Good evening. Welcome to the Phillips Center for Performing Arts. And indeed, I am Kent Fox, and I have the privilege of serving as president of the Florida Gators. I also have the privilege of introducing our speaker this evening. Dr. John Lennox is Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Oxford University. He's also a fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College, Oxford. He's an Associate Fellow in the Said Business School, Oxford University, and he teaches in the Oxford Strategic Leadership Program. He's written a large number of books, and I wanted to list just a few of them. In 2009, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? In 2011, God and Stephen Hawking, A Response to the Grand Design. And then in 2015, Against the Flow, a book that talks about the lessons learned in today's society from the life of the biblical figure Daniel. And he also has a book coming out in 2019 entitled, Can Science Explain Everything? This is my second time I've had the privilege of welcoming Dr. Lennox to the University of Florida. My first time was in the winter of 2015. And I would ask that you join me in welcoming back to the University of Florida, Dr. John Lennox.
Thank you, sir. President and Mrs. Fox, ladies and gentlemen, it is an extreme honor for me to be invited to come once more to the University of Florida. And the President did me a great honor this evening in that he pinned to my shirt a little alligator. So I am now qualified to say, go Gators! About a month ago, I debated someone from Florida State University, of which you may have heard, and he was a philosopher. And I debated him in London. It was a very interesting debate. You can see it on the web. But he wrote me the most interesting letter afterwards. He said, what a wonderful debate. I've rarely ever debated, this is what I remember of the letter, anybody who is so spectacularly wrong. So, ladies and gentlemen, as someone voted by a Floridian as spectacularly wrong, you're taking a great risk in listening to me this evening. But as I say, it is a pleasure to be with you, and we're going to look at this topic of artificial intelligence, threat or promise. Both words refer to the future. And in these times of very advanced technology moving at a speed that most of us can't keep up with, there are all kinds of fascinating ideas being spread around. I'm going to start with Yuval Noah Harari, whose book Homo Deus, Homo Man, Deus God, has sold in millions. It's called A Brief History of Tomorrow. Like every other author, he has got his own background philosophy. In his case, it is atheism. I am a Christian, and so we're going to compare two philosophical reactions to questions of the future of humanity. His naturalistic starting point is very interesting. He makes three major assertions. First of all, war is obsolete. You are more likely to commit suicide than be killed in conflict. Secondly, famine is disappearing. You are more at risk from obesity than starvation. And then thirdly, death is now just a technical problem. I quote, "Humans don't die because God decreed it, or because mortality is an essential part of some great cosmic plan. Humans always die due to some technical glitch. Every technical problem has a technical solution. We don't need to wait for the second coming in order to overcome death." And with this background, he says that in the 21st century, there are going to be two major agendas. Firstly, there will be a serious bid for human immortality. That is more precisely that we shall engineer things to defeat physical death. You won't have to die. You may die, but you won't have to. And then the second thing is the intensification of the pursuit of human happiness. And in order to get there, Harari says it would be necessary to change our biochemistry and re-engineer our bodies and our minds, so that we shall need to re-engineer Homo sapiens so that it can enjoy everlasting pleasure. Having raised humanity above the beastly level of survival struggles, we will now aim to upgrade humans into gods and turn Homo sapiens into Homo Deus. It is a very ambitious trajectory. And he claims further that for close to 1 billion years, 4 billion years, every single organism on the planet evolved subject to natural selection. Not even one was designed by an intelligent creator. The biologists are right about the past, but the proponents of intelligent design might ironically be right about the future. I think he just might be 180 degrees wrong in both of those statements. But what he thinks is this, that humankind is poised to replace natural selection with intelligent design and extend life from the organic realm into the inorganic. Now, this kind of scenario comes under the heading of artificial general intelligence. That is the human engineering of something that may be a combination of biology and technology that can do essentially everything that an intelligent human can do. And there are a number of people driving this kind of project. Ray Kurzweil is very famous for his prediction that in possibly as few as 30 years, AI robots will overtake humans in their intelligence and capabilities. Or Nick Bostrom of Oxford, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention man need ever make. provided that the machine is docile enough to tell us how to keep it under control. And that statement implies, of course, that these machines, or whatever you want to call them, are intelligence decoupled from conscience. And the whole business of the ethics of what will be made or constructed is increasingly a matter for serious discussion. One of the most serious writers on the question is Max Tegmark of Princeton. And he says that success in the quest for artificial intelligence has the potential to bring unprecedented benefits to humanity. And it is therefore worthwhile to research how to maximize these benefits while avoiding potential pitfalls. In creating AI, we're birthing a new form of life with unlimited potential for good or for ill. And Max Tegmark said that in a TED talk earlier this year. And there are serious voices on both sides of the Atlantic. One of our most distinguished, by far and away, scientists in the United Kingdom is Lord Rees, the Astronomer Royal. We can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of the way we behaved. And when you get voices at that level of science and culture saying these things, and their books selling in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, people are listening, and their minds are being geared to asking questions, at least, about where humanity is eventually going. Now, we've been talking about AI, but what is AI? And we need to distinguish two kinds. There's narrow AI, and there's AGI, artificial general intelligence. And an AI system uses mathematical algorithms, that is, sets of step-by-step instructions embedded in computer software. And we learn often at school the Euclidean algorithm and so on. But these algorithms sift and sort and select, going through typically huge databases. And the systems can learn to identify and interpret digital patterns, images, sound, speech, text, data, etc. And then computer applications are used to statistically analyze the available information and estimate the probability of a particular hypothesis. So a machine learning system takes in information about the past and makes decisions or predictions when presented with new information. And we're all massively familiar with this, because narrow AI is what we're carrying around with us all the time on our smartphones. Our digital assistants, Siri and Alexa, who jump ever increasingly rapidly to respond to our desires because they have sorted through a vast database of what we've done in the past. Online shopping. You look at Google, you look up certain things, and the next day you find a whole list of them appearing on your screen. Medicine, the results have been amazing. An X-ray, for example, of lungs. A great database of X-rays of lung diseases. And now the systems are so refined that if I take my X-ray and they put it into the system, it can diagnose what's wrong with me with an accuracy often increasing that of the best human doctors in the world. Autonomous vehicles. Well, we know all about them. Job searching, job interviews. Goldman Sachs now has people applying, but they're applying to a robotic AI interview. And people are really concerned, said the Times last week, because now instead of facing a human being interviewing them, they're facing cameras that are watching their every emotion, their every blink, their every attitude, and they're working out what you are like. And some very highly qualified graduate students say, I never get near an interview. Then, of course, there's AI used for crime prevention. The face recognition systems that are blossoming all around the world. And we can see that positive value in identifying criminals and terrorists. But then it spills over into the potential for social control, as in the system that is currently being rolled out in over 13 Chinese cities, where the cameras are watching you all the time, and you're given so many social credit points. And if you do something questionable on the internet, you lose points. And then you discover you can't go to your favorite restaurant, or you can't get a ticket to go abroad. Or you're walking down the street and suddenly your picture appears 5 meters high, and your name is called out, and you're denounced as a socially undesirable person. This is actually being rolled out, and they're hoping to extend it to the whole of China. The Time article on it is quite scary reading. The ideal setting for a complete surveillance state. And the author says, be careful, because all the ingredients for this are already present in the West, except that most of them are under independent control. There'll be one company with surveillance and closed-circuit television. There'll be another checking your credit, and so on. But all that has to happen is that these get fused into one. Then there's a vast moral problem of autonomous weapons. And there's a lot of ethical discussion about these things. The thing is vast, and trillions of dollars are being put now into narrow AI. And as you look at that list, you can see that a lot of these things, we welcome them. You like your smartphone. You like the fact that it's making predictions and so on, even though you often don't realize that you're giving away more and more of your capacity to choose to a machine. Now, there's a problem in this whole area with language. The term artificial intelligence or thinking machine can be very misleading. And Roger Schank of Northwestern wrote some time ago, cognition means thinking. Your machine is not thinking. When people say AI, they don't mean AI. What they mean is a lot of brute force computation. But the one I like best, and I think it's a marvelous one-liner, the artificial in artificial intelligence is real. Have you got that? It seems to me, says Professor Mellichamp, that a lot of needless debate could be avoided if AI researchers would admit that there are fundamental differences between machine intelligence and human intelligence. Differences that cannot be overcome by any amount of research. In other words, the artificial in artificial intelligence is real. Now, I started with Harari, but my attention was drawn to a rather unusual source for me, and that is Dan Brown. Have you all heard of Dan Brown? Well, he's written a number of blockbusting novels that sell in millions. And I was intrigued to discover he's written a book called Origin. And in this book called Origin, he focuses on two questions. Where do I come from? And where am I going to? It's, again, the origin and the future of humanity, but he's quite open about his motivation. It is to see if God can survive science. And when this was pointed out to me, I thought I need to read this. And one of his main characters is a billionaire computer scientist and AI expert called Edmund Kirsch, who claims that by using narrow AI, he has solved these two questions. And the intriguing thing is the way in which this is done. Facing the first question, where do we come from? He revisits the famous Miller-Urey experiment of 1953, where they put a mixture of chemicals, which they thought simulated an early Earth atmosphere. They sparked them with electricity, and they got some amino acids. And Brown discovered, and what he discovered is quite true, that those test tubes that were used had been put away in a laboratory, and they'd been sitting for 50 years. And someone took them out and analyzed the chemicals that were now in them after having sat for 50 years, and discovered, lo and behold, that there were more amino acids than they'd found in the first place. So Brown's novelist mind got going, and he thought, okay, if 50 years produces more, what would 100 years do? What would 500 years do? What would 1,000? What would 1,000,000? What would 1,000,000,000 years do? So he sets the huge database, and he sets AI to work on this. And lo and behold, as he watches the thing moving on the screen, he watches chemicals combining, recombining, all this kind of thing. And believe it or not, there appears on his screen the double helix structure of DNA. Now, I have a lot of things to say about that, and I've written about it, because natural processes do not generate language-like intelligence. But that's not my subject for tonight. It's that this is getting to the public mind. Now, when it comes to the future, what Kirsch, this computer expert, does is look at all the various structures that have been proposed for evolution and laid them all out and fed them into an enormous database and then extrapolated into the future. And as he watches the screen and the AI system operates, he watches a curious thing starts to happen. This is a bit of a spoiler, by the way, so you better close your ears if you don't want to hear this, what comes next. What happens on his screen is he sees a new species emerge. And then it absorbs humans. And he calls this new species technium, because it is a merger of biology and synthetic life and technology. So he's solved the two questions, and what he's done, you see, is to use narrow artificial intelligence on databases, the kind we can do, except that what he does is highly speculative, and predict artificial general intelligence. And when his scientist announces it to the world, he said new technologies like cybernetics, synthetic intelligence, cryonics, molecular engineering, and virtual reality will forever change what it means to be human. I realize there are some of you who believe that you as Homo sapiens are God's chosen species. I can understand that this news may feel like the end of the world to you, but I beg you, please believe me, the future is actually much brighter than you imagine. So here is this particular scenario. So that we're facing two things, really. There's the big scale predictions in which there's a vast amount of science fiction and imagination and hype, but we all love it because it's interesting and partly scary. Kurzweil's singularity, Homo Deus, technium. And then there is narrow AI doing many things which are extremely useful to us, but with all kinds of built-in ethical dangers. Of course, the question that raises is, what exactly is a human being? And what is it that we are trying to make? Are we attempting simply to use technology to enhance our capacities? Or are we trying to fundamentally change what a human being is. Now, I said that Harari and Brown come to this from a worldview perspective. That's what we all do. I come to this with a worldview perspective. They are both atheists, as many people in this field are, and I am a Christian. And your worldview, that is your set of answers to the big questions of life, they help you or hinder you navigate these questions. And my teacher of quantum physics at Cambridge, John Polkinghorne, makes this point. If we're to understand the nature of reality, we have only two possible starting points. Either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. Now, Sean Carroll, who is a physicist like Polkinghorne, comes now from the naturalist, atheist perspective, and he says, we humans are blobs of organized mud, which through the impersonal workings of nature's patterns have developed the capacity to contemplate and cherish and engage with the intimidating complexity of the world around us. The meaning we find in life is not transcendent. And of course, that's reductionist physicalism. And in the end, of course, it leads to the idea that since life has simply emerged from materials by unguided natural processes, surely this can happen again, but not in the biological sphere, but possibly in biology combined with silicon. But there's strong objections to these ideas, because it is one thing to say that the brain functions like a computer. It is an entirely different thing to say that it is a computer. And a former editor of Psychology Today wrote this: computers do not play games like humans play games. Computers do not create like humans create. Computers at their most fundamental level do not even solve computational problems like humans solve computational problems. And Sir Roger Penrose, arguably one of the most distinguished mathematicians alive, he argues that the brain is more than a computer because it can do certain things like formulate Gödel's theorems in mathematics, which no computer can do. And Leon Kass, who's always worth reading, a former presidential advisor in the United States here and a public intellectual of the first order, writes, we have paid some high prices for the technological conquest of nature, but none so high as the intellectual and spiritual costs of seeing nature as more material for our manipulation, exploitation, and transformation. With the powers of biological engineering gathering, there will be splendid new opportunities for similar degrading of our view of man. If we come to see ourselves as meat, then meat we shall become. And of course, there he's alluding to the famous statement that the brain is a computer made of meat. Now, I want to turn from the atheist perspective to the perspective that informs my worldview. Now, obviously, we will be mixed in our worldviews. I learn a great deal by listening to people that disagree with me and debating them. And I hope that this evening that you will at least listen to certain aspects of the Christian perspective to see at least if they make any sense. And only then are you in a position to judge the case. We've got to listen to a person's case, and then we make our own assessment. Now, the biblical perspective on creation is the exact opposite of the naturalistic perspective. First of all, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is to say that God is primary, and the universe's derivative. That is to say that superintelligence exists and has always existed, and that superintelligence was responsible for creating human intelligence. It's the exact opposite way round to this AGI perspective, which is that human intelligence is on its way to creating superintelligence. And the initial chapter of Genesis, which is utterly profound from any perspective, points out that the universe is created by a series of speech acts, and God said. And God said. And the idea behind that, of course, is the idea of information. It's not simply matter and energy, it's information. And of course, we've lived to discover that information is one of the fundamental concepts of science. And it's one of my main reasons for rejecting the materialistic view. So with this idea, we see that there are certain emphases in that text. And there are two of those famous creation days on which God speaks more than once, the third and the sixth. And on the third day, God speaks to differentiate between the inorganic and the organic. Now follow me carefully. According to the Bible at least, you do not get from inorganic to organic without an input of information and energy from outside the open system, which is the earth, and God said. And on the sixth day, you don't get from animals to humans without and God said. So it's indicating that there is a fundamental informational distinction between the inorganic and the organic, and between animal life and human life. Now that is the claim. And of course, we have to think about whether that makes more sense than the idea that the opposite happened, that unguided natural processes bridge both of those gulfs. And once you get there, you find that there is a second and complementary, more detailed unpacking of what human beings are. I'd love to have time to go through them because they're fascinating. Human beings are so much material. They're made of the dust of the ground. But they're more than that. They're alive. But they're more than that. They have an aesthetic sense. They're curious. They follow the rivers to find out where they go. And that's what many scientists and others at this university do, and what I do. We're curious about where the rivers go. And we try to follow the research fields. Then humans were given work to do. And so on. And as we look at these things, we can parallel to them attempts being made to produce something similar artificially. Starting with the dust of the ground, material, fine. But no one has ever created a living organism artificially. What would it mean for AI to have an aesthetic sense and curiosity? Well, those things are coupled to intelligence. And now we come across the idea that God linked intelligence and consciousness with human life. What artificial intelligence does is to separate intelligence from consciousness. See, the robot that makes your BMW hasn't a thought in its head. But it makes the car, it does what normally an intelligent human would do. But it doesn't have to be conscious to do that. And the fascinating thing about human beings is, as created by God, I believe, is that intelligence and consciousness are linked. Now, there are huge numbers of things here that need to be unpacked. For example, work. There's enormous fear in the world about robots and eventually AI taking over our jobs. And some of the estimates are really scary, 70%. Early robots the usual figure was one robot took 7 jobs from people. And that's going to increase and increase and increase. And so it raises a whole raft of questions. What is going to happen to people who are put out of work by artificial intelligence? I've just been in South Africa, and they were really concerned there because they said, we don't have the infrastructure to retrain people to be able to cope with the skills needed to work in the artificial intelligence field. So one of the things we learn from this is, secondly, that human beings originally were made as moral beings. They weren't only conscious, they had a conscience. And the famous story of the Garden of Eden, where you read of the prerequisites for morality. God gave them certain freedom, but he forbade one thing. They shouldn't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they were to have a moral relationship with God that was based on his command. And then the enemy came and said, look, God's trying to suppress you intellectually, and he knows that in the day you eat thereof, you shall be as God, knowing good and evil. And there's the very first Homo Deus project. The idea was spread abroad, and you can test whether it exists in Gainesville in the university, that if there is a God, he's against us as humans. He's trying to take away our freedom. He doesn't want us to rise. He doesn't want us to become gods. Now you see the relevance of this to what Harari is saying and Dan Brown is saying. It all fits together because the idea of humans rising is as old as history. And it was suggested, according to the Bible, by the enemy of humanity. There was also a second tree in the garden. We come to that in a moment. But you see, Paula Boddington, who's an expert on AI, says, if we see the Genesis account of the fall of man as foreshadowing of fears about robots, then Genesis gets the problem exactly right, for exactly the right reasons. It's a worry about autonomy itself. What might robots do if we can't control them fully? Will they adhere to the same value system as us? Will they decide to disobey us? What will our relationships with our creations be? We can thank the Hebrew account of Genesis for pre-warning us about this danger thousands of years ago. So it is a discussion about human autonomy. And one of the geniuses of this area, Rosalind Picard of MIT, who happens to be a Christian believer, has written, the greater the freedom of a machine, the more it will need moral standards. Now, I haven't forgotten Harari's claim that we're going to gain physical immortality. Because you see, in that Genesis story, there's another fascinating thing. And that was the tree of life. And what we're told is this, that when humans disobeyed God, they were refused access to a particular food so that they couldn't live forever. And you can't help wondering, you see, as you look over history, whether the quest for the elixir of life in the past or the quest for artificial general intelligence in the future aren't really driven by that loss of access to the tree of life. So there are a lot of things that we can investigate there. Harari proceeds on 2 bases looking at this problem. And he says that we cannot proceed without realizing that free will doesn't exist and that individuals don't exist. The first one is practical implications. If organisms indeed lack free will, it implies that we can manipulate and even control their desires using drugs, genetic engineering, or direct brain stimulation. Secondly, eventually we may reach a point when it will be impossible to disconnect from the all-knowing network even for a moment. Disconnection will mean death. And we can see with the concept of the network of things, we're getting increasingly connected to endless things, so that many young people and students, if our smartphone is taken away from us, we begin to feel withdrawal symptoms. We find we just can't afford to be disconnected. So that these are very real philosophical questions that all of us have to face. Now, this idea of homo deus is very old, as we've seen. But the Bible has a lot more to say about it than some people think. Because the central claim of Christianity is that there is a homo deus. There is a man who is God. And indeed, the whole of the biblical storyline is a preparation for God becoming human, the Word becoming flesh, homo deus. And the story is the exact opposite of the Harari and Brown scenarios. Because in their scenarios, man becomes God. The biblical scenario is that God becomes man and demonstrates that he is both man and God by his resurrection and his ascension. Now here's the central thing. The lie is that if there is a God, he's against us, so we'd better get rid of God, get rid of religion and everything else. But just a moment. Why did God become man? So that human beings could become what they were not by birth. They could become children of God. By birth, we are creatures of God. But the central message here is, to as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. And now we begin to see that there's a parallel biblical scenario to the AGI scenario, but it is utterly different. First of all, it tells us that the homo deus, Christ, will return. There is to be a future visit of homo deus. This same Jesus shall so come as you saw him go, the disciples were told at the beginning of Acts. And believers were told by Paul, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. This mortal body must put on immortality. Ladies and gentlemen, many people are taking the AGI scenario seriously, but what about this one? That you can be transformed, but not by the uploading of your brain into silicon to preserve it eternally. The Christian claim is that those that trust Christ and receive him receive a new kind of life which is imperishable. And my mortal body, probably a lot sooner than yours, will be planted in the earth. There is a day coming, I firmly believe, that I will be raised immortal. That is a spectacular scenario, and we want to be pretty sure that it's true, but then the evidence is both historical and personal. Historical in the life, death, and resurrection of the homo deus, Jesus Christ. Do you see the parallels? The hope is that your brain contents will be uploadable. How far that will go, we just don't know. But here is something that is promised on the basis of very strong evidence. Now, there is a final thing. Because there is to be another Homo Deus. And Paul, talking to a church, and he'd only been with them 3 weeks, wrote these words to them. For that day will not come. He's talking about a day of judgment. Unless the rebellion comes, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders and deception. And we just need to pause before we write this off as absurd. Paul was writing at a time when these people knew something like this. He said, this kind of thing is already operating in your society. The Caesars demanded divine honors. They were claiming to be Homo Deus. And many Christians went to their death because they refused to bow. And Paul says, watch that in your society. Watch that trend, because it is going to come to a harvest in the distant future. And Jesus will come and destroy a Homo Deus. Now just hang on to that for a moment, because that seems a scary scenario, but it corresponds with one of the superintelligence scenarios proposed by Max Tegmark. And he's got a whole group of them. They're fascinating. A libertarian utopia where human cyborgs and uploads and superintelligence coexist peacefully. Or a protector God scenario. Please notice the use of the word God, where an essentially omniscient and omnipotent AI maximizes human happiness and so on. And then there's the enslaved God. There's a superintelligent AI, but it's confined by humans. But then the conqueror scenario, where AI takes control and decides that humans are a threat and gets rid of them. And then there's the enslaved God, but the one he concentrates on is what he calls the Omega Project. And he imagines what could happen. For the first time ever, our planet was run by a single power called Prometheus, amplified by an intelligence so vast that it could potentially enable life to flourish for billions of years throughout the cosmos. But what specifically was their plan? Now, what is very interesting about this to me is that there's something very like it described in the last book of the Bible. It talks about a beast that deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all to be marked on their right hand, so that no one can buy or sell unless he is the mark that is the name of the beast, of the number of its name, the total surveillance state. And it adds this very curious statement. The number of the beast, 666, for it is the number of a man. And people have speculated about this absurdly, and they miss the point. This beast that is described as being anti-God is a human. So Paul, in plain language in the first century, said to people, watch those movements in society that are pushing for the deification of man, because they will lead to a slavery of a kind that has never been known before. The book of Revelation says exactly the same thing. And when I find people of the intelligence of Max Tegmark saying, here's one of the scenarios, and it overlaps beautifully with what the Bible says, at least I'm going to take it seriously and not write it off as absurd speculation. Now, John Gray is a famous atheist, and I've learned a great deal from him. And he says humans may well use science to turn themselves into something like gods as they have imagined them to be. But no supreme being will appear on the scene. Instead, there will be many different gods, each of them a parody of human beings that once existed. But he's wrong. A homo deus will appear from heaven. And there is going to be a divine upgrade. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven, writes Paul to Christians. Or again, I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. This mortal body must put on immortality. And often those words resound from a graveyard, and they give colossal hope to people that have pinned their faith on the Lord from heaven. So how do we conclude? Well, first of all, fear of the scary scenarios should not prevent believers making a contribution to the positive aspects of narrow AI to the benefit of all. Rosalind Picard again. We've decided it's more about building a better human-machine combination than it is about building a machine where we will be lucky if it wants us around as a household pet. I like to be up to date, ladies and gentlemen, so I read this today in Forbes magazine by one of the world's leading experts on AI from China. And it's a very balanced statement. AI can handle a growing number of non-personal, non-creative, routine tasks. But the skills that make us uniquely human are ones that no machine can replicate. The jobs of the future will require creative, compassionate, and empathetic leaders who know how to create, trust, build teams, and inspire service and communicate effectively. And he points out elsewhere in his book that so much is speculation and myth. So let's not confuse AGI, the attempt to make a human being or something like it, and narrow AI, which is focused usually on one thing, to do one thing expertly, like read X-rays and so on. So where does that leave us with humanity version 1, of which we are all members? Why do I believe that you and I are infinitely special? Here's my main reason, ladies and gentlemen. The ultimate affirmation of humanity version 1.0 is that God became one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lennox. As we transition to a time of Q&A, 2 quick announcements. One, just a reminder, the questions are still live. So if you have not logged on to Pigeonhole, now would be a great time to do that. We're getting some great questions already. So please go on, fill out a new question or upvote ones that you like. Again, that is pigeonhole.at, and the passcode is UFQA. Also, if you'll notice, right under your seat is a response card and a pen. This would be a great time to grab that and start filling that out, just to interact more and give us some feedback on tonight's event. Our moderator tonight is Michelle Tepper. Michelle is a speaker for RZIM, an organization that exists to dialogue about life's biggest questions and their intersection with the Christian faith. She has worked alongside Dr. Lennox in similar events in Oxford, Europe, and throughout North America. Please welcome Michelle Tepper.
Thank you, all for your wonderful questions. We had so many come in, and I just want to give a few explanations before we go into this time of Q&A with Dr. Lennox. There's no way that we could have let every single one of the questions come through to be voted on, because probably that would have gotten 1 or 2 votes on every single one of them. So we tried our best to group similar questions together. We had lots of the questions that we put through for voting. There were many similar ones, so we tried to group them together. And just to remind you that with the time that we have, we will try to do our best to do the highly voted ones and ones that are on topic. So thanks so much again for your submissions. So Dr. Lennox, to start off, let's go with the highest voted question tonight. So man is made in the image of God, but artificial intelligence is made in the image of man. What are the consequences of this subtle difference? And I'll bring that up for you to see as well.
Well, now, thank you for all your questions. I should have said at the very beginning that I'm writing a book on this topic. That won't surprise you. And that's why I'm looking forward to these questions, because what they're going to do is force me to think and maybe revise and add them into the book. So thank you very much for asking them. Man made in the image of God, that is the claim. But AI is made in the image of man. And one of the things that characterizes the image of God in human beings is our rationality and our creativity. God is creative, and he has delegated to us the ability to be creative with the materials that he has given within the world. Now, what are the consequences of this subtle difference? Well, it's difficult to know exactly what's lying behind the question. Clearly, our abilities are limited. God created a universe by speaking. Now, that very first thing separates God vastly from human beings. If I say, let there be light, nothing will happen unless you press a switch at the back of this hall. But that's cheating. And it's the same with materials. We work with fascinating materials, and we combine and recombine and produce new materials. That is new to us, but they're still combinations of what has been given. And I often say that those of us who are scientists ought to be humble, because we study a given, that is the universe, with a given. So that it seems to me that the initial response to this question, by the way, this is a Q&A. You're going to learn how ignorant I am. I can only begin to respond off the top of my head, so to speak. But it seems to me that in the very descriptors that we get, there are parallels. For example, Genesis in its literary structure gives us God having a working week like we have a working week. But there, the comparison ends, because what God did in that week, we cannot do. So we have abilities. Now the question is, how far will those abilities, I suspect that is what may lie behind the question, how far will we be able to go? Now that very strange text that I read to you from the book of Revelation talks about an image being made, but it's enabled to speak to such an extent that the entire planet is deceived. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not some innocent little conjuring trick. And you see, there are some people who say, well, God would never allow human beings to make something like that. Well, if they think that and it happens, they'll be the ones who'll be maximally deceived. And the answer is, I just don't know. But there are indicators in some of those texts I've read that we need to be careful in placing limits. And let's not view this as negative. It is absolutely magnificent what human beings have been enabled to do. And we, those of us who are Christians, thank God for it. And the rest of us are thankful for it, but we've no one to thank. And It is important, though, that we celebrate that kind of thing. But it seems to me somewhere in there is a distinction. We are not God. And the same goes on. I said that it's possible for a human being who trusts Christ to receive a new life, the very life of God, new powers, but they don't become God. The biblical record is very careful to make those fine distinctions.
Well, this kind of goes along with it. There was a question that's not voted quite as high, but it was asked many different times, and it came along these lines. It said, would creating AI actually be replacing God itself?
Many people think so. This is certainly an idea that's out there in space, because think of the network of all things and add to it artificial intelligence. It knows more and more about you and me. And interestingly enough, we're voluntarily giving it information about ourselves all the time. We're being tracked by GPS all the time. We are, at least in England, every 5 minutes on CCTV. The Chinese are installing 600 million CCTVs this year alone. And the object of that is that there's going to be an essentially omniscient, all-powerful, all-seeing. Those are some of the attributes that are often theologically associated with God. And that is why in those scenarios for the future that I quoted you from Max Tegmark, 2 of them have got God in the title, because to all effects and purposes, this is AI replacing God. Now, the ancient persons' gods were not so much things that they loved, but things that they trusted. Now, we're finding more and more that there are difficulties with AI. I had to get my credit card renewed just a week ago. Why? Because British Airways was hacked. And so many million details, all my credit card details, were gone, just like that. And so we realize that there are problems, but we're trying to plug the problems, and as we plug the problems, we're still giving the information. Because I still will have to use that credit card and give that information to someone. So this is a very important thing. What do we ultimately trust? Is it going to be a human creation? And that's what the ancient gods were. They were made of stone and wood. They were not sophisticated. This is going to be much more sophisticated. And in many people's minds, it is functioning like a religion. Look at the hours that people spend on Twitter and Facebook and all this kind of stuff. That's telling you something about the authority that we are voluntarily ceding to something that's outside of ourselves. But it isn't transcendent. It isn't God. So the question we may have to ask is, who is the God that we really should owe allegiance to?
Well, following on from that, on who is the God, this question came in. It says, if AI reaches a point where it is more intelligent than humans and can design, create, and innovate on its own, does this support or disprove the possibility of an omnipotent God or creator?
Well, if. And of course, this is the point. Most honest reporters all across the spectrum say that we're nowhere near this. Remember, no one knows what consciousness is. No one. So we are apparently light years from this, so far away that there are many people who believe, who are committed to research in AI, believe this will never happen. So it is a hypothetical question, and hypothetical questions can be dangerous. But the point is, suppose that did happen. Well, what does it prove? Well, it proves that beings created by an intelligent creator can create beings that can create. That doesn't disprove the existence of the original intelligent creator at all, I would have thought.
That's a good point. Well, then how about this one? Because it seems that there's a lot of questions around this. We tried to focus them down into a few. What if artificial intelligence reaches the point where it is intelligent enough that we can no longer control them? And not a lot of speculation tonight, Dr. Lennox. Do you think they will decide to keep humans around, or will they view us as too large or a liability?
This question, was asked by Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking. He was afraid of this. Elon Musk was afraid of this, still is. And there's been a huge petition going around the place to try to do ethically responsible research into areas of artificial intelligence much lower than this point, but the move towards that point. Now, do you think they will decide? How could I possibly answer that question? I think if I tried to answer it, you'd write me off. How would I know? I simply don't know. But all we can say at the moment about that kind of thing is highly intelligent people are thinking about these things, and they're worried about the ethics. Why are they worried about the ethics? Because the technology moves much faster than the ethics. This is happening in medicine. And it's happening in this area. It rushes ahead. You design autonomous vehicles. Well, immediately the military want to use them. And now you have a huge ethical problem. Even with an autonomous, driverless car, you have a problem. Humans have to program what they will avoid and what they will hit. And so inevitably people will get killed. How do you make those ethical decisions? Simply because the AI system, let me put it this way, doesn't have a conscience, it will have to be given one. And it will have to be given one by human beings acting on the ethical principles that they believe in, but all of us are flawed. And that's what creates the problem. So policing this is going to be a huge problem.
So following on from that, what would you say the moral responsibilities are for creators of AI?
Oh, huge.
How do we begin to consider these things?
Well, we have to consider them because we are building things just at the simplest level. I build a machine, it puts 100 people out of work. Should I implement it or not? Now, there are people running factories in this country who could get rid of 70% of the workers, but they don't do it. They could replace them by machines, but they don't do it. And it's very interesting reading what they have to say. They say, no, my value system is those people have lives, they have families, and so on. And as long as I can keep going, I will keep going. Other people say, oh, you're Luddite, you've got to replace them with machines, they'll find other jobs. Well, maybe, but maybe not. But it's quite clear that since AI systems, they don't think. The artificial intelligence is real, so that the moral responsibility lies with the creator, not with the machine. If a lion bites your head off, it won't appear before the Supreme Court, and nor will a robot. But if you programmed it, you will appear.
That's true. So, would you say, if this ever got to be the case, that a fully conscious artificial AI would deserve the same rights as a human being?
People are considering this, but fully conscious. Let me repeat. No one knows what consciousness is. We're nowhere near this kind of thing. So this is highly speculative and totally hypothetical. And to my mind, it's so hypothetical that there's no way we can begin to answer it. But there are some people who are working on the legal rights, as they do with the legal rights of animals. They're working on the legal rights of machines. But it seems to me this is going way beyond. You tell me what consciousness is, and maybe I'll be able to think about it.
Okay. So maybe trying to get away from some of the abstract and maybe hear some more of your views. They've been so helpful. What are the ethical? So you've said very clearly there are moral considerations. What are the ethical considerations of technological developments that are being used in attempts to augment human intelligence? Could you give us a framework of some sort? What ethics you would think are important?
This is again a huge area. It depends entirely what you are trying to do. Some of the things that people are doing don't really raise ethical concerns. Mm-hmm. For instance, if I am born with a very weak muscle in my left arm, and an engineer creates an exoskeleton of some kind, that's augmenting my ability. Now, the question refers to augmenting human intelligence. And of course, my first question to the questioner is, what do you mean by augmenting human intelligence? Mm-hmm. Well, we're attaching things to ourselves. You see, we have these things up to our ears most of the time. We now wear them on our watches. It'll not be long before they're implanted in our heads or our brains, and so on. They'll get closer and closer to us. And in a sense, we are augmenting our intelligence with that kind of thing. If you could simply think Google and look something up in your head so it appeared before your eyes, that would be an augmentation of intelligence. And what are the ethical considerations? The ethics of this kind of thing tend to be very complex indeed. The trouble is, the question is a generalist question. Okay. You have to say specifically where, what are you thinking of, what actual thing, and then you have to apply to it. And of course, it just proliferates so rapidly. So unless you can make it more precise, there's nothing very much I can say.
We have someone who said, just going on the precise one, you say that AI is intelligence decoupled from consciousness. What do you think about engineers creating mathematical algorithms that will begin to teach complex emotions? Will they ever achieve that goal? Now, I'm not a mathematician like you, but I don't know if that's coming from less of a generalist.
No, in fact, Rosalind Picard is one of the world experts on building emotion into AI. But now, what does that mean? In these interview AI systems, these are systems that are reading your face. Mm-hmm. And they are being taught by humans, of course, what those things mean. And then that's embedded into the system. So the AI system isn't developing emotion. It's the people that are programming the system, are programming into it things that recognize, so that if you put a certain person's CV in, and the interview, it can say, well, that person's emotionally unstable and all this kind of thing. Now, I haven't read, and I'm ashamed to say I haven't, a lot of Rosalind Picard's work, but her work on using AI to understand complex emotion has been enormously valuable in research on autism, on autistic children in MIT. It's a marvelous work. She's actually single-handedly created a whole branch of artificial intelligence. But we've got to stand back and remember the artificial in artificial intelligence is real. The machine doesn't experience emotion, but it can recognize the significance of gestures that are emotional and make allowance for them and so on and describe them.
So the top voted on question right now kind of goes on from that. It says, can AI be given too much personality or emotion?
Well, again, what do you mean by giving it personality? Defining what personality is not an easy thing. We all recognize it, but it's like time. We all know what it is, but when you're asked to define it, none of us can. And an AI system, just let's get our feet back down on the ground. An AI system these days is designed to perform a single function, usually, that would normally be done by an intelligent human, like recognizing lung cancer and so on. So giving that kind of system narrow AI personality is almost a meaningless thing. Now, what I think may be behind this is not AI, but robots. You know, and you get these dear little creatures, and you can buy them at vast expense. And they'll come, and they can behave like a dog, but they don't poo, and they don't make a mess. And they're very friendly, and they don't die, and you don't have to feed them, and you don't have to give expensive operations to make them well. But they provide emotional support, just like animals do. Animals aren't human, but they do provide support. And if that's what's meant, I'm not sure too much, too little. How would you measure that anyway?
I'd be really worried if my daughter's little live pet dog had too much personality. I think that would scare her at night.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's being said, because you notice in my list of what it means to be human, one of the things is the man-woman companionship.
Yeah.
And of course, the idea of a companion robot, an intelligent robot, one of the points that the experts in this area are warning us about is the vast difference between a robot and a human is the robot doesn't care. And that care and empathy is something that one of the experts I quoted just doesn't believe will ever be produced.
So this links into me to this question. Why do you think we as humans are so drawn to creating artificial intelligence, or let's say robots? What's the desire behind this movement? Why?
My own suspicion is that the biblical analysis is right. There's a deep-seated human historical memory of that, what happened in that garden situation in Genesis. It's well worth reading Leon Cass on this, because he's a brilliant Hebrew scholar and he's a literary genius of the first order. He's written a book on Genesis, and he points out that the origins of so many things in our culture today are there. You have the idea of freedom. Are we really free? The idea of seeking for autonomy, of discovering that the autonomy we get leads to alienation between humans and God, etc., etc., etc. And the trigger of it is appealing to wonderful human capacities of reason and wisdom. In the day you eat that, you'll be as God. God does not want you to rise to his level. There's a great deal of that feeling still around. And that's driving it. Why should we not reach God? Why should we not build a human, build a man? That is a colossal drive. It's like a very simple version of it is the drive to build the biggest building. Every country wants the biggest building. And someone has well written, behind every skyscraper there's an even bigger ego. It's a very interesting kind of thing. There's a project, and there's another one, the Tower of Babel project in Genesis. Let's build a tower that it might reach to heaven. That kind of desire to move upwards and build something significant. Now, we all want to be significant. We want to make the best of our human intelligence. But the danger is we get it the wrong way around. We're seeking to create Homo Deus when Homo Deus is seeking to recreate us.
So going on with that image of God, if we were created by God, wouldn't we be considered artificial intelligence, his intelligence being the original intelligence?
The big difference here is that he created conscious intelligence. You see, being in the image of God doesn't simply mean we do the same things that an intelligent person would do, but our intelligence is artificial. See, artificial snow, what is artificial snow? It's not real snow, is it? But it reflects one aspect, and one aspect alone of snow. It looks like snow. Do you see? That's why it's artificial snow. But we are not artificial intelligence. We are real intelligence, because God is capable of creating what I suspect we're not capable of creating, which is real intelligence, so that we can create, he can speak, we can speak. He is conscious, we are conscious. But AI is nowhere near any of these things, because it's artificial.
Many of the characteristics you listed, even maybe when you're talking about what real intelligence is, what makes life life, are also possessed by animals, dolphins, pronates, etc. So are we all really that different?
This is argued endlessly. And the thing that I would focus on is the nature of the linguistic capacity that human beings have. Now, clearly, some animals can go a certain distance, but people who've really studied this, and people like Chomsky and so on, they make the point that there really is a vast difference when it comes to our linguistic capacities and our ability to make extractions. Mathematics is one of the most very distinctly human activities. Now, we can argue this again and again and again, but are we really all that different? What would the point of saying that be? What I mean by that is, if there is a creator and he's built different levels of things, well, why shouldn't he in that sense? My dog and I can enjoy a good steak. But if I showed a Picasso or a Rembrandt, he might do all sorts of curious things to it that I wouldn't mention. But he won't see the point of it. So that, again, you can speculate, but it's what are you getting at? Are you trying to tell me there's nothing unique about humans? And I would come back to my very final statement. Human beings are so unusual and unique that God could become one. I mean, when you think about that, it is utterly spectacular, if it's true.
That's a good take on your dog and on human beings and what's different. This question is about to jump off the page at me, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. People want to know tonight, Professor Lennox, do you have or who is your favorite fictional artificial intelligence character? Do you have one?
Not really.
Come on, Gators. We'll let you think if one comes to your mind. Here's another one. Do you think human employment and thus the economy will be or could be affected long-term by artificial intelligence?
Well, I'm not an expert economist, but I try to read what people are saying. What I notice is that the major economic surveys that are made on this, there's one done in Cambridge, there's one done recently over here, are fairly highly varied. Some people think that 70% of jobs in the United States are at risk in the next 20 or 30 years. Some think it's longer, some think it's shorter. The answer to the question is, of course, yes. Everybody agrees, but what the total effect would be. Some are very optimistic, especially in developed countries, of the capacity of the educational system to cope with retraining people and moving them into these areas. And some even think that more jobs will be created. So it's a very open thing. The most difficult thing to predict, is the future.
That's very true.
That's a Yogi Berra quote, by the way. It's not me.
Professor Lennox, you've been so patient with what to me seems to be a lot of generalist questions. So as the final kind of couple of questions tonight, we got quite a few around these type of topics. Have you tried to look at what other religions said about this subject, or I would say other subjects of science, to strengthen your argument? There was another question that came in that said, do you actually believe that artificial intelligence is the mark of the beast, and how can you believe these things in the Bible? So as we kind of close our evening tonight, have you looked into other faiths and other worldviews?
Of course.
What makes you want to kind of, you've argued so heavily from a Christian and even biblical worldview.
If you were listening tonight, you'd have noticed that most of the people I quoted were atheists or people of other religions. Of course, there are people from all kinds of different religions that look at these things, and philosophies and worldviews. Now, in my life, I have, in the public space, most often been confronted with leading atheists like Richard Dawkins and so And so what I tried to do, and what I tried to do tonight, is to be fair. I think I quoted tonight 2 Christians out of all the people I've mentioned. So I hope that's an indicator that I'm listening to what these people are saying. And it's not so much religion, it's philosophy. And where the divide comes is the question of, as Paul Kilhorn put it in one of those earlier quotes, the starting point comes down to this. You either believe that there's transcendence and a creator God, or you believe that this universe is all that exists and everything crawls upwards, so to speak, by mindless, unguided processes. And as a scientist, I simply don't believe the atheistic and naturalistic worldview. Now, I've argued this elsewhere, but I'm not sure quite. You mentioned a couple of things. Do I think AI is the mark of the beast? Well, no, of course not. But what is the mark of the beast, according to that, is a human being who takes planetary control by using a very sophisticated AI surveillance system. But to say the AI that is used in examining lung cancer slides is the mark of the beast, that's just foolishness. But I'm not sure what you're asking about other religions, so perhaps you want to make it a bit more precise.
I'm bringing back that question. We've just seemed to have quite a lot of questions around, I guess, why do you lean so heavily on the Christian worldview
I see.
as opposed to other ones? And because you pulled from very Christian, very biblical, even passages, even though you were very ecumenical in going across the different scholars that you spoke about.
I want to know what's true. And I was brought up in a Christian home. But my parents loved me enough not to force their Christian convictions down my throat, but give me space to think. And they were the first to encourage me to read my first alien worldview, which was communism and Marxism. And I owe them a huge debt. They allowed me to think because they loved me. And because I come from a country with a bad reputation for Christianity, I'm from Northern Ireland, if you didn't guess. And many people say to me, of course, you're Irish and everybody believes in God there, and they fight about it, often to the death. And I met that at Cambridge a great deal. So what I've spent my life doing, and I started in my first week as an undergraduate, I'd heard this Freudian objection so often. You believe in God because you're Irish, you know. Well, it's the kind of thing you hear sometimes. You say that because you're a woman, or you say that because you're, you know, the kind of thing, which is a very illogical kind of argument, but I'm not going to go into the philosophy of it now. But what it did for me was, I decided that I would befriend people, not just get to know them, but befriend them. People who didn't share my worldview. And I've been doing it for all of my life. So for over 60 years, I've been talking to people and being vulnerable about my worldview. And you see, when it comes to religions, and I have friends in all religions, and as you look at religions, you find, well, there's a shared morality. That's very clear. The world would fall apart. Most religions believe in honoring their parents, in the value of truth, and in not murdering. C.S. Lewis pointed that out long ago. But where the differences come, and I think that may be behind the question, why should I be a Christian kind of thing? Well, my reason is this, that what I find in religion is that, generally speaking, they're like the University of Florida. But what I mean by that is, it's hard enough to get in. There's a doorway to get in. This is a good university. It's pretty hard to get in, isn't it, folks? You're pretty pleased you got in. And then you study, and you've got gurus and professors and imams and priests. Well, you've got professors to teach you. they can't guarantee you're going to get a degree because you face a horrific thing at the end called final examinations. Have you heard of that? So there's a door at the beginning to get in, and there's a path to be followed, and there's a day of judgment at the end. Yep, you've got it. Now, when I talk to many people and ask them to describe what they mean by religion, that's what they say to me. And I say, but you see, if that's what religion is, then I'm not religious at all. And they say, what do you mean? Well, I said, you think of that situation. I'm a University of Florida student, I'm a gator, and I'm trying my best, and the professors are very kind, but they cannot guarantee me getting a degree. Why? Because it's based on my merit. And you will find, if you look at religions, ask people. That's the way to find out. That that's what they'll tell you. Even some professed Christians will tell you that. I do the best I can. And I hope that one day God is going to be kind to me and relax his law a bit and let me in. You know that kind of idea? Millions of people believe that. But now here's where it's utterly radical. I don't believe that. So as I sit here, let me put it very provocatively. I read certain statements to you about the resurrection of the body. And I believe as I sit here that one day I will be raised from the dead. Why? Because I'm something special? No. Because the basic principle of Christianity is not merit. Now, can you understand that? This is so important to get this. Otherwise, you'll never understand what it's about. You see, Christ offers me something that no other religion offers me. He offers me forgiveness, not at the day of judgment, but now. He tells me that if I repent and trust him, I receive at that very moment a new kind of life. I receive forgiveness. I receive peace with God. And I receive the certainty that one day I will be upgraded into heaven. Not because of what I've done. I can't earn that. But because of what he's done. Now there's the vast difference between religion and true Christianity. It's telling me that I can have a certainty here and now. I'm not waiting for the final judgment to decide what's going to happen to me, ladies and gentlemen. Because I know what's going to happen. Now, it might be a strange thing for you to hear an Oxford professor or any other one say, but it's true. The heart of this thing, the biggest thing in my life, is that God loved me and Christ died for me. And as I say, let me put it very clearly and lovingly. Jesus Christ competes with no other religion because he offers me something that none of them do. It's as simple and as profound as that. So that it is a very, very big issue. And therefore, I do look at these things. All of us are biased, of course, but we have to ask, are we biased by reason of evidence or prejudice? And you have to examine the facts and decide for yourself. And the reason my faith in Christ has strengthened over the years is precisely because I've looked at all the alternatives and spent a lot of time doing it. And in the present culture of almost institutionalized naturalism in the universities of the Western world, I've been up against it, really up against it. But it seems to me that naturalism doesn't answer the facts. And science, of course, does not explain everything. So that would be my response to that question.
Thank you for your candor in that. Yeah, let's give him a hand. That was great. You've given us so much to think about on the topic of artificial intelligence, on the topic of consciousness and the difference, and also left us with a great challenge. So thank you again for coming to the University of Florida. We are so grateful, and I'm going to invite Chris to come back out. Thanks again, Dr. Lennox.
Hey, thank you. A couple announcements as we close. Thank you. A couple announcements as we close. One, if I could bring your attention back to the response card that was under your chair that you were filling out earlier. There are 2 boxes there in the middle. One of them says, simply count me in. We invite you to check this if you're ready to have more of these conversations. Just how God intersects some of life's greatest questions. We would love to engage in further discussion around that. So you can check that box. The second one says, tell me more. We invite you to check this one if you want to hear about future events that we have coming up. One of these, in fact, will be this January 28th to February 1st. It's Hungry Week. This is the second year we're hosting this. A number of campus organizations here at UF partnered together to bring us this week. It is 15 separate events that ask thoughtful and engaging questions about life, faith, science, and culture. You can expect free lunches, live Q&A, and great conversations. So please check that out next semester. Finally, if you have some further questions or would like to dialogue, we invite you to do that. There will be some people around in black shirts. Some of them have the Hungry shirts on. Those are great people to continue the dialogue if you want to do that this evening. And finally, just a big thank you to Dr. Lennox for an engaging conversation this evening. Thank you.